Okay, all right. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. And thank you to Peter Gries and the Manchester China Institute for inviting me, and especially to Will Kirby for helping me with logistical matters. It's a great pleasure to present to you today. I wish I could be there in person, but I guess we're all stuck with Zoom. One of the reasons I retired actually was motivated by my distaste for Zoom, but I'll do the best I can. What I'm going to do today is first present a kind of overview of my first book on museums in post-socialist PRC, but the bulk of my talk will concern my more recent book on museums in Taiwan. I'll first present some key thematic trends in post-martial law exhibitionary culture, and then focus on one museum, the National Museum of Taiwan History, which was established in 2011 in Tainan. So my work on Taiwan museums is a kind of outgrowth of my first book on museums in post-socialist China. In this first book, I look at the politics behind historical representation in a variety of museum types and how those representations have changed since the Mao and early post-Mao eras. Conventional Mao era revolutionary narratives continue to exist in some exhibitionary contexts, but in others we find radically new narratives. First, new representations of late Qing and Republican era modernization and commercial life that lay a kind of historical foundation for the market economy of the post-socialist present. Second, the commodification of revolutionary history through what is called red tourism. Third, the glorification of local cultures as a reflection both of nativist consciousness and the multi-ethnic nation state. Fourth, martyrdom as an emotional hook for forging national unity in a splintered social environment. Fifth, nostalgic modes of remembrance that elide historical trauma. Six, the reemergence of traditionalism, including strong connections with the imperial past and the Confucian social and ethical tradition. And finally, the uses of victimization and trauma, particularly with respect to Japanese imperialism, as a vehicle for shared national sentiment. My focus is on the role of the state in shaping historical narratives through state-funded museums. I do not mean to suggest that the state has a complete monopoly on historical memory in the PRC. Clearly, online, in fiction, in film, there are plenty of what might be called alternative historical memories. But I don't think we should overemphasize these alternative memories to the neglect of the role of the state in forging official narratives. Whether in an autocratic or democratic societies, people tend to accept prevailing narratives, not because they are unthinking or passive, but because their personal identities, subjectivities, economic well-being, and dreams are intertwined with those narratives. In my opinion, we fail to understand China in its fullness if we neglect these official historical narratives and their power to persuade. So just look at one example quickly. The final chapter of the PRC book concerns not the past, but exhibitionary spaces that project imaginations of the future, what are called urban planning exhibition centers. These spaces, which can be found in almost all of China's major urban centers, put on display images of future developments in their respective cities. On the slide lower left, you see the Shanghai Urban Planning Exhibition Center with photos of its centerpiece display, a model of what Shanghai will look like in the not too distant future. I see these spaces as utopian in their view of urban life and implicit endorsements of the PRC's modernization project. The political and utopian dimensions of these urban planning centers becomes clearer when we juxtapose them to, say, Jia Zhangke's vision of urban ruins in his film, Still Life. So I end the book with this chapter on urban planning exhibition centers to suggest the interconnectedness of past, present, and future in historical memories. So a past whitewashed of its injustices, which is the case in many museums in the PRC, is intertwined with fantasies of a utopian future. The focus of my talk today will be on my new book on the politics of museums in Taiwan. As you can see from the table of contents, my approach to both books is political. I'm concerned with the politics behind historical representation in museums, most of which are state funded. In the case of the PRC, that politics is driven by a single political party. In post-martial law Taiwan, it is driven by two main political parties, the KMT, also called the Nationalists, and the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. This book takes a somewhat comparative perspective on exhibitionary culture, both in Taiwan and in China. First, a little historical background to Taiwan history. Since the 1970s, Taiwan has experienced a dramatic political transformation that was, since my printer for some reason has just started to go crazy. I have no idea why. So Taiwan has experienced a dramatic political transformation from a single party dictatorship under the KMT to a multi-party democracy. Like the post-Mao liberalization on the mainland in the 1980s, this transformation was spawned by a death of Chiang Kai-shek in 1975. Jiang Jingguo, Chiang Kai-shek's son, initiated the political reforms, which recognized what is called dangwai, political elements, that is, political groups outside the KMT. And he also ended martial law. Then in the 1990s, President Li Denghui ushered in reforms that led to the first ever presidential election in 1996. And to the election, I apologize. I don't know why my printer is doing this.
No worries.
Is it disturbing? Is the noise disturbing?
No problem.
Okay. And then Li Denghui ushered in further reforms that led to the first ever presidential election in 1996, and then ultimately to the election of the opposition DPP in 2000, and to the thriving multi-party democracy Taiwan now has. History and historical memory have been particularly sensitive topics in post-martial law Taiwan. During its single-party rule over Taiwan from 1947 to 1987, the KMT sought to control the representation of history. It suppressed local Taiwan history and upheld a Sino-centric view of the past, a cultural policy that served the KMT's political platform that Taiwan was part of China and the nationalists had an in absentia dominion over the mainland. In the KMT cultural rhetoric and policy, Taiwan was also the bastion for the preservation of traditional Chinese culture. And Taiwan's culture and history were ignored or radically downplayed, reduced to a history of interaction with the mainland. Of course, the KMT also suppressed memory of more recent history, including that of the Japanese colonial era and the White Terror, so-called White Terror foisted on Taiwan from the late 1940s to the late 1970s by the KMT itself. So from the 1950s to the 1980s, the KMT propagated its historical and cultural vision in museums and memorial sites, particularly in Taipei. Exhibitions in the 1950s promoted an anti-communist agenda and the nationalist fantasy of restoring the country, Fuguo. Typical of museums and memorial sites in the nationalist era were the National History Museum, the National Palace Museum, the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, and the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. These sites presented a Sino-centric view of Chinese history, or they contributed to the propagation of the cult of Chiang Kai-shek. With the political liberalization of the 1980s, many intellectuals, writers, and political figures started questioning the KMT narratives of the past and the KMT monopoly on the meaning of that past. The Taiwan nativist Bantu movement of the early 1980s suggested that there was a uniquely Taiwanese subjectivity, 主体性, that was an accumulation of Taiwan's particular history of multiple occupations and colonizations. They called for de-Sinicization, 去汉化, that is, the decoupling of Taiwan's history and identity from China, and from the promotion of Taiwan's own history and culture. As a product of these nativist trends, since the 1990s, new museums and new kinds of museum exhibitions gradually appeared to display facets of Taiwan's history that had been repressed in the martial law era. These museums, often promoted by the DPP, tended to focus on 4 aspects of Taiwan's history. Number 1, prehistory, that is the history of Taiwan prior to written records and well before the Han Chinese immigration to the island. Number 2, the history of Taiwan's interaction with non-Chinese cultures, in particular during the Dutch and Japanese colonial eras. Number 3, the trauma and human rights abuses inflicted on Taiwan by the nationalists during the Jiang era, particularly the 228 incident, which refers to the February 28, 1947 uprising against the KMT rule that was violently suppressed by the KMT. And number 4, Taiwan's Aboriginal cultures. Let me take a quick look at each one of these trends. The most prominent in the prehistory museum category is the National Museum of Prehistory in Taidong, which was established in 2001. In the KMT era, Taiwan's history was thought to begin only in the Ming Dynasty. In other words, the history of Taiwan corresponded with the history of Han immigration. By contrast, this museum and other museums like it draw attention to a much earlier history of Taiwan's ancient civilizations. The museum forges an historical origins for Taiwan, an origins that is largely independent from the mainland. It suggests that the people of Taiwan today are connected to those who lived here millennia earlier and to the land that gave up the artifacts from these ancient civilizations. The museum placard, which you can see in the upper right, makes this idea of roots to the past explicit. It reads, "Facing the future, we treasure the past, for without history, we have no roots, and without roots, we have no future." The second trend is Taiwan's long history of interaction with the world, which is stressed in a variety of exhibitionary contexts. An exhibit called Isla Formosa, the emergence of Taiwan on the world scene in the 17th century, held at the National Palace Museum in 2003, marked a radical move for an institution that had always been associated with the display of quote unquote Chinese culture. The cover of the catalog, upper left, shows a map of Taiwan from the Dutch era with Taiwan on its side, that is the east at the top, and no mainland visible. The introduction to the catalog puts Taiwan at the quote center of the East Asian maritime traffic and stresses the history of Taiwan's quote emergence on the world scene unquote. The exhibit expresses a global cultural attitude that is at the heart of Taiwan's new self-identity in the post-martial law era. In 2005, the National Museum of History, another bastion of the Sino-centric historical narrative, mounted its first Taiwan-related exhibit titled Oceanic Taiwan, a dialogue between the people and the island. Again, this exhibit emphasized Taiwan's history of contact with the world beyond its shores. And indeed, the term oceanic, Haiyang, is a central trope in exhibitionary discourse in post-martial law Taiwan. This reorientation of Taiwan away from China and outward toward the world is embodied in the map on the right. If you can see it right here, this is Taiwan, but it's a kind of disorienting map, right? Which I think is precisely the purpose. Other museums stress Taiwan's interaction with the world by depicting the Japanese colonial era as a period of the birth of Taiwanese modernity and even Taiwanese consciousness. For example, the February 28th Memorial Hall in Taipei. In this museum, the history of Japanese colonialism is presented positively compared to that of the KMT period. This is a discursive strategy of making the KMT look bad. Some scholars have called this the pro-colonial historiography, and is part of the process of de-Sinicizing Taiwan's history and culture by emphasizing the Japanese social and cultural influences there. This museum, of course, also exemplifies the third trend I mentioned, exposing the wounds and trauma inflicted during the nationalist era. It was ushered into being by Chen Shui-bian, DPP mayor of Taipei, who would go on to become the first non-KMT leader of Taiwan. The museum is more than just a testament to the victims of 228. It presents, in essence, an entire history of Taiwan, from the Japanese colonial period to retrocession in 1945, to the incident itself, and to the history of KMT martial law and the White Terror. Other memorial sites have opened in the past decade or so that focus on human rights abuses, such as the Jingmei Human Rights Culture Park on the site of a detention center in Taipei for political prisoners during the martial law era. The core of this site is the prison, which you can see pictured in the upper left. And also the Green Island Human Rights Culture Park, where leftists, Taiwan nativists, and dissidents were incarcerated more long-term. Several of the people detained in Jingmei eventually ended up in Green Island, the prison there. In 2011, the administrative yuan in Taiwan initiated the process of joining these two sites, that is Jingmei and Green Island, into a single entity called the National Human Rights Museum, which of course gives more visibility to the two memorial sites and allows them to speak more clearly for the nation. The final trend is museums and exhibitions that detail the history and cultures of Taiwan's Aboriginal peoples. Taiwan has two major museums, the Shunyan Museum of Aborigines and the Katagalan Cultural Center, and two theme parks, one near Sun Moon Lake and the other outside of Kaohsiung, devoted to indigenous peoples. Since the 1980s, Aboriginal cultures have been put on display in the service of de-sinification and the forging of a unique Taiwan cultural identity. Museums that focus on Aboriginal peoples, as well as those on the prehistoric origins of Taiwan, contribute to creating a national imaginary, founded on a sense of rootedness in the physical place of Taiwan and to the construction of a new identity for Taiwan as a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation. The Tsai Ing-wen administration announced in 2017 the location of a future National Museum of Taiwan Aborigines to be located in Kaohsiung, but it is not projected to open until 2027. Some of these Aboriginal museums go so far as to suggest that because of intermarriage between the Han Chinese and Aborigines, in particular the Pingpu tribes, a new Taiwan ethnicity has emerged. A placard in the Katagalan Cultural Center exhibit is labeled "Looking for the Shadow of Our Pingpu Brothers." And the inscription reads, "What is the Pingpu ethnic group? Where are they? Who are they? The folks saying, have a Tangshan father." Tangshan basically means Chinese. So having a Tangshan father, but not a Tangshan mother, best reflects the indisputable fact that the Taiwan Pingpu ethnic group has nearly fused into a single blood lineage with the Han. This kind of discourse is an extreme version of the vision the DPP seeks to display through the four exhibitionary trends I've been introducing: de-Sinicization, historical rootedness in Taiwan, ethnic diversity and interaction with the world, and democratic pluralism. And these have contributed to forging a unique Taiwan identity. Even as the DPP and Taiwan nativists appropriated exhibitionary spaces for their cultural and political causes, the KMT and those sympathetic to its cultural vision have not stood idly by. The KMT has sought to tame the excesses of Taiwanese cultural consciousness in some museums and memorial sites, and to assert Taiwan's cultural ties to China and downplay the horrors of KMT rule in others. In short, the struggle over the past in Taiwan has become embroiled in the oppositional politics of Taiwan's multi-party system. And Taiwan's two main political parties have both actively used museums and memorial sites to promote their cultural and political agendas. This is seen most dramatically in the example of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. It was built at the height of KMT power as a commemoration to Taiwan's quote unquote Lincoln, when the DPP was in power and Chen Shui-bian was president. DPP politicians co-opted the space and converted it into the Taiwan Democracy Memorial Hall, which exhibited human rights abuses under the nationalist regime. When, with the return to power of the KMT in 2008, the original name of the Memorial Hall was restored. At present, the status of the memorial is in legal limbo, though DPP Minister of Culture, Zheng Yijun, expressed a desire to revamp the exhibits to focus on human rights issues. So now I turn to the Museum of Taiwan History. In the fall of 2011, not long after Beijing unveiled its new National Museum of China, the National Museum of Taiwan History celebrated its grand opening in Tainan in southern Taiwan. This is the first museum dedicated to the history of Taiwan. The idea for the museum can be traced back to 1992 during the Li Denghui presidency, after martial law had been lifted and the KMT's grip on power was loosening. However, it took more than 7 years for a preparatory committee to be formed, and almost 20 years for the museum in Tainan to finally open to the public, suggesting the difficulty of reaching consensus as to what kind of story to tell. The Tainan was chosen as a site because of its historical importance. Tainan was the center of Taiwan politics and culture until Taipei displayed it in the latter part of the Qing dynasty. Everyone's museum, 大家的博物馆, is the museum's slogan, which tells you something about the museum's desire to appeal to all constituencies, which I will discuss further as we go along. So the main exhibit in the museum is called Our Land, Our People, the Story of Taiwan. The exhibit is divided into 7 parts, organized into chronological order. So the first section is the early residence section, encounters between disparate cultures, Chinese migration to Taiwan, territorial societies and plural cultures, transformations, and the new order. This deals with the Japanese colonial era towards a diverse democratic society, and finally peering into a new century. The very first display is a large video screen that captures images of people entering the exhibition space, which is on the 2nd floor. So as you go up the escalator, if you are alert, you'll actually see yourself in the screen, next to which is a sign that reads, "Who are the Taiwanese?" The display suggests that everyone whose image appears there, including a foreign visitor like myself, is Taiwanese or potentially Taiwanese. The accompanying placard reads, "Thus, the term Taiwanese as a form of self-affirmation, impossible to define with a particular language or ethnicity. All those who identify with and are concerned about Taiwan, who love and accept Taiwan, and who wish to live together in this land, can declare with a loud voice, 'I am Taiwanese.'" The display raises the question of what it means to be Taiwanese and the question of who can lay claim to being Taiwanese. The openness and inclusiveness of the category of Taiwanese is unlike anything I have ever seen on the mainland, where notions of Chineseness are a given. Whereas in some Taiwanese nativist discourses in the 1980s, the Hoklo, the speakers of Minanyu, were positioned as uniquely Taiwanese, this museum takes a kind of post-identity politics view of Taiwanese identity that emphasizes not language or ethnicity, but rather one's ties to the land and to the culture. In this sense, it is strongly nationalist. A recurring leitmotif in the museum is diversity, 多元, geographic diversity, ethnic diversity, and cultural diversity, part and parcel of the long history of immigration to and multiple occupations of Taiwan. Displays through the exhibit emphasize in positive ways the cultural contributions of the Dutch, the Spanish, the Chinese, and the Japanese, as well as Taiwan's Aboriginal peoples. The exhibit also shows a tolerance of the multiple ways of looking at Taiwan's past, but its discourse of diversity clearly asserts Taiwan as a modern pluralistic nation. There is a kind of telos to the museum's narrative, that is, Taiwan's cultural diversity in its past leads inevitably to its march toward democracy, which is the title of the exhibit's final or second to last display. The museum's emphasis on ethnicity and cultural diversity seems to be part of the positioning of Taiwan's national identity in opposition to a quote unquote essentialized identity for the Chinese mainland. If the mainland is homogeneously Han and has a conservative continental culture and an autocratic state, Taiwan, by contrast, is open and inclusive, ethnically diverse, interconnected with the world, and democratic. The section on Chinese immigration constitutes the largest part of the exhibit. So in no way is the museum in a radically de-Sinicizing mode. And here we have a diorama of the Chinese merchants arriving in Taiwan. But this display on the Japanese colonial period is second longest and most detailed part of the exhibit. The exhibit does not disregard the Japanese military, political, or cultural control over Taiwan, which it exerted through the power of the local police, mapping, land surveys, household surveys, and so on, though it could have done much more. There is, for instance, no mention of Japanese comfort women stations in Taiwan. But on the whole, it is rather positive in its representation of the colonial era. One of the ways it emphasizes the allure for Taiwanese of Western modernity brought to Taiwan by the Japanese is through exhibits like those pictured here, which are nostalgic representations of Japanese cultural influence. The exhibit on the colonial era also contains positive displays on, for example, contributions of Japanese anthropology, which offered the first systematic ethnographic study of Taiwan's Aboriginal groups. Also modern infrastructure projects such as Sun Moon Lake Power Plant and so on. It also gives a lot of attention to the formation of a modern health system, a modern education system, the latter of which, according to a placard, quote, opened a window to the world for members of the Taiwanese elite who absorbed elements of modern Western civilization while developing a specific Taiwanese ideology. In this museum, the colonial era gave birth to Taiwan identity or a Taiwan consciousness. There is a large display on the Taiwan Cultural Association and the journal it published, the Taiwan Minbao. This organization was principally cultural. It promoted vernacularization and the new literature that was being pushed on the mainland, but it also had a political agenda of seeking self-rule for Taiwan. The colonial and political Taiwanese the cultural and political Taiwanese consciousness promoted by this organization filtered down to the popular level as well, with the appearance of hit Taiwanese language songs such as Our Taiwan, where you can see pictured in the lower right here. The colonial era is also depicted as the beginning of Taiwan democracy because the first elections in Taiwan were held then. And we can see a display of people going to the ballot box. So rather than a period of oppression, Japanese colonization is depicted as key to the material, educational, cultural, and political modernity of Taiwan, as well as the rise of Taiwanese consciousness among the people. A museum educational pamphlet for school children poses the question, if you lived in that era, would you choose to accept Japanese rule or resist it? But the picture of ethnic diversity and harmony presented in the museum seems blind to a history of ethnic strife and violence. The history of indigenous peoples' encounter with a parade of outside occupiers has been far from a happy one, involving at the worst violent suppression campaigns and at best a range of civilizing policies. Ethnic tensions between mainlanders and Hoklos are downplayed, and relations between Japanese and Taiwanese during the colonial era are generally portrayed in positive ways. The museum seems to be motivated by a post-identity politics desire for ethnic harmony, rather than drawing attention to ethnic conflicts and the traumas it caused. It seems to be interested in healing the wounds of the past and forging a notion of unity in diversity. And just as the repression of the Japanese colonial era is whitewashed, so too is the violence of the KMT era downplayed. In some other exhibitionary contexts, the 228 incident is the defining historical event in the shaping of Taiwanese identity and consciousness, its Holocaust, so to speak. In the National Museum of Taiwan History, however, 228 and other facets of KMT white terror occupy a relatively minor position. The 228 incident has just one small display consisting of a single enlarged photograph with two small placards, one on the incident itself and the other on the repression that followed. There is no lingering on the trauma or reflecting on the significance of the event to Taiwan national consciousness. Rather than a time of political repression, the exhibit on the martial law era conveys a nostalgic feeling. In the upper left is a recreated classroom with an image of Chiang Kai-shek, and to the right is a placard about military compound culture, this zhenzun. In neither exhibit is there any reference to military dictatorship, intellectual repression, or educational brainwashing. To the lower left, you can see a photo of a Mandarin speech competition, which has no mention whatsoever of the suppression of other Chinese dialects under KMT rule. The cultural and social pluralism that is the main narrative thread in the exhibit also serves to lay the discursive foundation for a narrative of the emergence of Taiwan as a democratic society in the 1980s and 1990s. The sixth chapter in the exhibit is called Striding Towards a Diverse Democratic Society, and the exhibit makes an explicit link between Taiwan's multicultural history and democracy. One display entitled An Era in Which Everyone Can Have a Say shows various groups protesting such things as nuclear power and nuclear waste disposal, political oppression and white terror, the limiting of academic freedom, etc. The exhibit is careful not to demonize the KMT for inhibiting the development of democracy in Taiwan. Instead, it focuses on in a more positive way on the eventual unleashing of democratic forces. The museum presents a rosy picture of democratic pluralism and the idea that people's voices matter, which may be problematic in the present neoliberal world dominated by entrenched political power and corporate interests. Social history is at the forefront of a special exhibit called Taiwan Memories, which appears at the end of the main exhibit, but it's a constant throughout the museum. The museum's mission statement lists one of its goals as, quote, to construct common historical memories for the Taiwan people. Given the multiple political, social, and ethnic constituencies in Taiwan, it's no easy task to arrive at a common historical memories. But in an attempt to do so, the museum avoids or downplays memories that serve the interests of one constituency or that makes another look bad in the name of creating a sense of common investment in a national narrative. A narrative of diversity leading to democratic pluralism serves this purpose nicely, as does a nostalgic mode of representation that downplays historical trauma, political repression, and ethnic conflict. The museum's permanent exhibit seems to avoid the polemical and confrontational approach to historical memory that characterizes some of the museums and exhibitionary spaces developed during periods of more radical Taiwanese nativism. In the process, the past becomes de-traumatized, a happier place to visit, a place of ethnic and cultural harmony. The museum does not rile up ethnic differences so much as it seeks to harmonize them in a multicultural mosaic. The Wu Mi-cha, who was the first director of the museum, himself acknowledges that the museum presents a quote unquote consensus view of Taiwan's past. So it is less of a challenge to conventional modes of historical representation than it is an accommodation of the interests of different groups with a common narrative of striving for democratic pluralism. And with that, I will end my talk.